afterwards. So obviously, there are two things now that I want to talk to you about that I feel are quite important. So one is obviously world whiskey and the relevance of that in the industry now. And the second is you've obviously gone slightly left field and set up your own Wizards of Whisky. So I think first of all, we'll talk about the Wizards, if that's okay. And if you'd kind of like to explain a little bit more about what the Wizards of Whiskies is and how you came to set about it and what the initial idea was.
Yeah, okay. So the Wizards of Whisky, probably in there, I think this is their 9th year. And what happened was, when I left Whiskey Magazine, I just thought what I'll do is I'll find distilleries in funny parts of the world and I'll get on an EasyJet flight or a Ryanair flight and get them to put me up for a night and then go and see the distillery, taste a few drams with them, go to the pub, get to know them, have a laugh, interview them, fly back the next day. It's cost me £29 return on EasyJet, cost them nothing except for the hotel room and a few drinks maybe. And then I sold it to three different magazines or outlets and I got paid whatever. And that's how I made my living. But what I did was, increasingly, I found that I had lots of whiskey that I didn't really know what to do with. So I set up the whiskey tasting club, and I started doing tastings in Norwich. And those people who ran the discounting club, Tony, he's on the beach. He's at a pub on the beach at Overstrand in Norfolk this minute because he's just Facebooked me. But Tony and I are still best friends, and we still we do virtual drinking together once a week on here. But once a week we go to the pub before the lockdown, and I was bringing them. And at the time, I was writing my first book. Japanese Suntory sent me 3 different sizes of all their bottlings, so I'd been getting like 20 bottles of Japanese whiskey and tasting that much, and thinking, so what do I do with it? So I started doing tastings, etc. And then people started. There was an inkling of interest, and then. When I had the conversations with the Australians, and I told you earlier about, they questioned their statements, they basically, their attitude was, there's a statue, why shouldn't I knock it down? Why can't I do what I want? But that didn't mean they sacrificed quality. So I just thought it'd be good to eventually, I thought it'd be good to actually recognize that. So I set up the Wizards, and it's just an awards. It's basically for smaller independent companies, and so you can't enter 10 whiskies. Well, you can, but you'll have your score averaged out so that a distillery only entering 2 or 3, because that's all they've got, will average out against a distillery tasting 10. And I basically judged that. What I introduced was, we scrapped the expression rest of the world. That went. We don't really, until last year, we hadn't had any Scottish entries because I hadn't allowed it. But last year I allowed micro distillers in Scotland to enter, because why not? They took perfectly time, the independent Scottish distillers. But the idea was to judge by continent, and we don't break down on age statement because it varies so much. I mean, I've tasted Amorets at 6 years old that are as good as anything from Scotland 25, 30. I mean, so that was the point of the Wizards. The timing is I meant to launch them now. So they're normally launched in July, and the entries go through to the early bird entry until September, and then they go right up to the end of November. And then they're judged over December and January, and I announced them sort of late January. I've never done them as thoroughly as perhaps I should. Unfortunately, I'm a man of millions of ideas and an executor of none.
Yeah.
So anything going for 8 years for me is just off the scale. I mean, this is 9th year. So it's about the only thing I've ever done consistently for a long time. But it's great because what I tend to get is distilleries who haven't entered anywhere else, because these awards are channeled to them, and they're fairly low cost and not expensive. But what happens is once they start winning awards, so I was giving awards to Balcones and Corsair for anybody else.
Mm.
But once they'd had those awards and they went to the Nationals, and Balcones' story is what it is, they were very loyal to me for a long time. They've been very, very supportive, but they get on to bigger things. But I don't mind that, because I like, it's the old journalist instinct, you know, I'm able to say, hey, this is a malted whiskey drink. It's not whiskey, but it's an American malted spirit made from a beer and matured in bourbon casks.
Yeah.
And it's a kind of American single malt, but it's not really whiskey because it's got hops in it. I love that. And it just keeps things fresh and interesting.
And so do you break these down into categories, or is it just one big category? And
no, so I break them into, so I judge by continent, first and foremost. And then I tend to have single malt whiskey and other grain whiskey and new make. We've introduced a category for spirits that have been bottled under 3 years old. And I have what I call hybrid category, which is basically all those things we just discussed, where you start using all sorts of things that can't constitute a whiskey. Like craft beer that's been distilled, so it's hybrid. So they are categorized to a point, but there's no judgment on age particularly. It's not really an issue because most of the entries are going to be fairly young.
Yeah,
just is, you know, we've not got. Then we have no, that's not entirely true because we do have quite a few European entries that obviously apply to European rules.
Yeah, and so are you finding that? Obviously, like you say, you're now into your 9th year. Has that grown astronomically over the last few years, or is it just a nice, steady progression with the amount of distilleries coming online now?
That's a good question. It's just a fabulous time. Part of the problem is sourcing them. So, you know, last year I got a bill from the American Distilling Institute to send me his up-to-date craft directory. And I sent invites out to every single one, but I had to manually input those.
Yeah.
So that took a huge amount of time. And part of the problem is, and it won't be helped by lockdown, is that a lot of them are under the radar when it comes to publicity. I always tell this story about a few years ago. I went out to Germany for a weekend, and to cut the long story short, the distillery that I got 3 pages in Whiskey magazine to write about was basically a shed at the bottom of this German bloke's garden. And he didn't speak any English, and I don't speak German. And he had what was basically a dustbin for a still. And that was it. And so I said, well, at least we can taste your whiskey. He said, I have no whiskey. I only have fruit liqueur. And the reason was, it was in Jim Murray's whiskey guide. It sounded really exciting, etc. But the stuff he was making was on such a small scale that he sold it out locally. And that's the other problem I have with my awards. Once they reach a certain level, they don't want the publicity anymore. And the last thing that just Tasmanian distiller needs is me giving them an award and them getting some publicity in Europe because they can't serve the market.
Yeah.
They've got East Asia to worry about. And so very politely, they stop backing you. So it's a hard question to judge. Maybe with this lockdown, I should, you know, set aside 3 or 4 hours to do research and just put in words every country I can think of and put, you know, Latvian whiskey. But how do I hear about these things? It's very, very hard sitting in Norfolk in lockdown and realizing what's going on everywhere else.
I mean, that's an interesting theory, the fact of you kind of see a distillery wanting to get the publicity. And in a sense, it's great that they get this publicity, they might win awards, and then all of a sudden, everybody wants the whiskey. But like you say, if they're very small on capacity in that, and then they can't source the whiskey to the people that wanted it in the first place, it's a double-edged sword.
It is. And I'll tell you what, it's interesting you say that because it's exactly true of the English Whiskey Company.
Yeah.
What happened with the English Whiskey Company was that they got in Ian Henderson as a distiller, and they decided to trial in November. The idea was to trial, close down for Christmas, and basically correct all the things that were wrong, and then launch in January. That was the idea. What actually happened was the first runs were so good they bottled them. So 3 years later, in November, at the end of November, the English Whisky Company suddenly had whiskey available, and they got masses of media, masses. And I was working at the whiskey shop at the time, and I used to go in a lot over Christmas time. And we had maybe 7 people a day saying, "You've got any English whiskey?"
Mm.
And apart from the fact that the managing director of the whiskey shop wouldn't do a deal that was favourable to the English Whisky Company, and therefore we had very little, even though we were the Norwich whiskey shop. The fact is, it sold out incredibly quickly. And then there was nothing again until way, way into the new year. So there was a whole 4-6 week period where there was no English whiskey. And when they came back, the story had been done.
Mm.
There was a lot of people who were not happy about not being able to get English whiskey that first Christmas. That was one of those unfortunate byproducts of instant success.
Yeah.
And it had to be thought through. But that's what happens. It's not good media. Not only, I mean, you can say grape is sold out, but actually to consumers, especially now, because consumers move on so fast, they're not coming back, they're not waiting.
No, well, that's it. And I mean, you know, the fact that, you know, we all know the English Whisky Company was the first one to reopen its doors as a whiskey distillery in England. But, you know, people don't realise we only make about 60 to 70,000 maximum litres a year of alcohol, which is minuscule. You know, I mean, you could almost call it a craft distillery.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I 1 year, I don't know if I still do it, but I sort of defined a craft distillery as anything really under 300, 400,000 litres a year. Because if you look at the old figures, for Scotland, rarely did a distillery produce less than 1 million.
Yeah.
You know, and the Glasgow distillery is on the wrong side because they wanted to enter the awards last year and then said, but we can't because we're too big. And I kind of laughed at that a bit because they were exactly the same. I thought, well, where do you set your parameters? Because from a commercial point of view, the wider that is, the more likely they are going to be able to afford it because they're making more whiskey and therefore the budgets are better.
Yeah.
You know, the guy who's making 30,000 litre down the road, he's not really, one, he doesn't need the publicity. He's going to get it by just being in the local paper or whatever. And 2, he's not going to be able to afford it because he won't have budgeted for a market spend. So they're the harsh realities. And I seem to have made a career of picking very financially unproductive horses to ride.
And I mean, that kind of leads us quite nicely moving on. Obviously, we're talking about the English Whisky Company, and how excited are you now about the English whisky scene? Obviously, living in Norfolk, you're very close to the English Whisky Company. So, but you know, now we're looking at 27 distilleries in the UK. So, you know, it's an exciting time.
Well, in England, you mean? Yeah.
In England, sorry, yeah.
It is an exciting time. I can't keep up with it. You know, you could say exactly the same about France. I love France. I'm very proud to say I'm on my 17th consecutive week without missing a day's lesson. I teach myself French for an hour a day, purely as a mind thing.
Yeah.
I have cyclothymia, which means that it's a form of bipolar disorder. So I get very up, and I'm very kind of this. And so therefore I need to do things that actually occupy my mind. So French is great for that. And I love France, absolutely adore France. And I used to think of myself as pretty on the ball with France. And then I asked, when I was editing Whisky Quarterly, I asked a French journalist, Sophie Bigot, I don't know if you know her, but she's a French journalist. And I asked her to write me a feature, and she came up with a figure like 25. Really? I hadn't a clue. And I'll be honest, I didn't know we were at 27. You're on the ball more than me. That is part of the problem. But I'm really excited by it because, one, the frontline quality, the English Whisky Company, Lakes has been doing some great single malt bottlings. I've just finished a bottle of Lakes whiskey the last week or so. My last press trip, I cancelled a press trip to Lakes because there was worry about a coronavirus, and they weren't rude to me at all. They're not in the slightest, but they was a little bit put out that I'd used this excuse not to come. The trip never took place because within 10 days of me making that decision not to go, because I've got family and I didn't feel, and we've got elderly relatives, and I felt I didn't want to risk bringing it back.
Yeah. And
that would have been my last press trip, and it will be, hopefully, it will be one of the first from the restart. But what they're doing is great. What you're doing is great. Some of the stuff in the warehouses of the English Whisky Company, It used to be an annual ritual to go over there for an afternoon and just get locked into a warehouse and taste various concoctions and finishes and some amazing stuff happening there. And not breaking the rules, but thinking out the loop, triple distilled and, all sorts of interesting cask finishes going on there and things prepared in cask. So Cotswolds, I think it's great. Oxford, I think it's great. So I am very, very excited. But I also think, wow, when you're my age, it's just great to look ahead and think, well, there's no way I'm going to run out of track. This is ongoing, and where we'll go with it, I don't know. But wow, isn't it great fun?
It is, and I mean, I remember going back to sort of 2005, 2006 when the English Whisky Company was first founded and started, and now, I mean, we've now just obviously released our 11-year-old. And you kind of think, where's time flying? Where's it going? And like you say, we've got the Lakes, superb whiskies coming out. We've got Bimber. I think Bimber's whiskies are absolutely superb. There is such a full-bodied flavour there at such a young age. We've got Cotswolds. And it just, to me, it's just an exciting time to be involved in English whiskey.
No, without doubt. Without doubt. I mean, I remember when I was the editor of Whiskey Magazine, I got a phone call from James Nelstrop, the original founder.
Yeah.
And he said that he was applying to the South Norfolk Council to put his distillery on a greenfield site. But the council officers were recommending that they put it into Attleborough on an industrial site right next to Wolf Brewery. And he said, could I write to the councillors and tell them about pagodas and mountains and rivers and no pollution and all that stuff? And I did. And not only did the council unanimously back the greenfield site, but they reprimanded the officers for not doing any proper research into it. And I remember that was February. I remember in March at Whiskey Live, Andrew Nelstrop coming up to me and saying, I've got a distiller. And he told me it was Ian Henderson. And it was like, oh my golly gosh, wow. Typical of a maverick Scot. He just loved the idea of being involved with English whiskey. Being able to dine out Scottish fair and say, I introduced English whiskey. His daughter was down here studying, so he had a reason to come down. And that was in March. Blow me, they were producing spirit by November. Not even built the thing. They were producing spirit by November. And I look back on that and think that's my favourite story to follow through, because down the road, literally go every year.
Yeah.
And I'm due to catch up with Andrew again. I haven't seen him for ages. And but basically, wow, what a time to be in a job. I always say that being involved with whiskey, we step onto a conveyor belt, and you go to some of the distilleries and you see the pictures of when the conveyor belt was way back in the 19th century. And the people on it have now stood off. They've died and gone away. They've passed on. You get on it and eventually you're going to step off. But what you're working with is going to outlive you. And you can look at it in some ways, it can be a bit depressing to think like that. But if you think about it, what you're doing is you're basically hoping that the spirit from your era on your watch stays to the standard that it was before, and you hope it will be afterwards. And that's almost taking us full circle to why no matter what happens with world whiskey, the SWA is important.
Yeah.
Because that conveyor belt sped up, and there's more conveyor belts to get on. The bottom line is we need that one that's going to be constant and take us through. I'm starting to sound like Alan Partridge with an over metaphor.
The beauty, like you say, we started off with Ian, and what a big coup it was to get him into an English whiskey distillery to start the system off. But I do think we need to give a big shout out to David. So David Fitt, who's our current distiller, who's basically putting everything together now. And I think talking to him and his passion and his insight to the future is superb, and where he wants to go and what he's doing, and allowing the spirit to talk for us, which is very similar to White Peak as well. They're allowing their spirit to talk, and this is superb.
Right, I'll say a couple of things there. White Peak, I should have mentioned, they won an award in last year's Wizards.
Yeah.
And they were so excited. It made it so why I do this.
Yeah.
It's all, the pleasure that gives me is off the scale. The other thing, I'm glad you mentioned David, because I saw an advert locally recruiting for a new distiller at the English Whisky Company.
Yeah.
So I thought he may have left.
No.
So I tweeted him, I private messaged him about what's happening, David. Have you left? Or what's gone on? And he didn't reply. So tell him from me, I was asking after I'll get in touch with him somehow.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think basically what we've done is we've taken, I don't want to call it an understudy, so we have taken another distiller on just to help him out. So,
Okay.
I mean, I'm hoping there's no other reason than that, you know, because I think he does a fantastic job. But I kind of want, I mean, yeah, I know what you're saying with Max as well, because I know he was extremely excited to start winning awards, and especially, you know, the Wizards. But I kind of want to jump into world whiskey now.
You do. Say one other thing. Do you mind? I think this is another thing about David I'd just like to mention. When I started writing about whiskey, basically the process that mattered was the distillation of the beer, the distiller's beer. And to get to that process, you know, they talk about a lot about soft water, and that's all well and good. And the truth is, nowadays you can treat water to make it soft. Glenmorangie does, Highland Park does, English Whisky Company does. So that's not such a big thing anymore as it was historically. But what they didn't talk about was the fact that to make good beer, the beer in the first place, requires hard water. And the process, Burtonisation, it's not far from Leicester, Burton. And Burtonisation is almost the addition of calcium to harden the water to make better beer. And when I started in the industry, there was very, very little about the beer part of the process. You just got there and then made whiskey. And people like David are coming from an English brewing background. And now if you go to Scotland, you'll find any number of English or English-trained brewers now working. Glenfiddich has. And I was able to have a 20-minute conversation, very Anaraki, about the beer at Glenfiddich with an English brewer. And that the process is being looked at much more as the whole thing. And David I think, can take some credit for that. Not just him, but that bringing the values of good quality beer. And then he has always thought outside the box as well. And he'll try stuff, and he won't be afraid to try stuff. And not all of it works, but when it works, wow, just stunning. So, yeah, I just wanted to mention that how important brewing has become because of people like David.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, that, you've got to kind of have that big understanding of brewing to start with to be able to create. And, I look at what David, I was quite critical of the spirit we put out early on. But I look at what they're doing now, and I get the story and the journey that they've done to get there. And it kind of does lead me on again to the world whiskey side, because you look at what the world whiskey scene is doing, and you kind of mentioned it earlier. You either do it the same as Scotch, or you do it totally different. And that's very intriguing to the sense of it's a big compliment to the Scotch that people want to make it like Scotch. But like you say, if you do it that way, you've got to be good at it.
Yeah, and I think there's, the English Whisky Company is one example where it has been done. I think some of the companies that have brought in Dr. Jim Swan to help us. So I'm thinking Stauning in Denmark, what they're making doesn't taste anything like Scotch single malt whiskey, but it's distinctly there for a reason. Swedes are very, very good at taking maybe some older grains and lower yielding grains and going back to things that were done in the 70s and 80s maybe, and making really good quality Scotch whiskey. So I think David Roussier in France and Warringham. His whiskey was quite ordinary, and then Jim Swan came in, changed the cut, made a few adjustments to temperature, blah blah, and the next thing, I haven't tasted his whiskey for a year or so, but I've always enjoyed his whiskey. The Australians too. So yeah, I think it can be done.
We had David on a few weeks ago, and you know, the passion there. And sort of talking about the brewing side, I think I could be wrong here, but isn't Langerton, aren't they sort of come from a brewing background as well?
Again, I think the interesting thing about I do a lot of work with the Alpine regions. Myself and Arthur Nagler, who runs a spirits business across the border in the south, Austria, Germany, Switzerland, around Lake Constance. He does a lot of training in all sorts of spirits, and I work very closely with him. And we're looking at doing some stuff with Alpine Spirits together. And a lot of where they came from, in fact, where they went wrong was that they came from a brewing background and then they made spirits from it. And when they came to make whiskey, they did it the same way and it didn't work. But through people like Arthur training, and there's now some knowledgeable distillers over there that they're starting to make really good quality whiskey. But that some of them, Fana is a big fruit manufacturer, you know, fruit juices.
Yeah.
And they've been able to invest in a micro distillery. It's really state of the art, and bring in good professional help to make sure the quality's there. But a lot of them are breweries too. There's a huge brewing tradition in that part of the world, and it's moved on. So yeah, very exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think world whiskey in general is a very exciting topic, and it's thanks to, again, we're going to do another plug here, but like Boutique Whiskey, I mean, they're bringing out a phenomenal amount of world whiskies. And I mean, you know, I first tasted things like Santos and Millstone and like Langerton, and I'm just looking to see what I've got up here. You know, there's loads, and without companies like Boutique, we wouldn't know about these world whiskies, European or, you know, sort of other continents as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the hardest things I found was, you know, I go to tastings with all this whiskey and everyone will say, wow, that's amazing. Where can I buy it? I say, you can't. It wasn't available. Just wasn't available. And that's why, going back a little bit, I launched my own whiskey label called Discovery Road. I'm a crap businessman. I'm absolutely bloody useless.
You see, this is where you should now be holding a bottle up.
Sorry?
This is where you should now be holding a bottle up.
Some of it's still in English whiskey distillery, actually. It's been, I think there's some left in Bond there. But anyway, but that was the problem, you know. I could talk all you like about Millstone and the early Macmyras and all the Amrits, the original stuff. Nobody could buy it. And then that changed. Some of those companies established themselves in their own right, but certainly Boutique Whiskey Company has been very exciting and very open-minded. I'll tell you, there was surprisingly, not so much, but still does it, Scotch Malt Whisky Society. You know, they'll suddenly do an amazing cask of cask strength Penderyn finished in Portwood, and you just taste this stuff, and it's as good as you'll taste anything, and you just think, wow. So, so it is changing, but yeah, Boutique Whiskey Company, a lot to thank for, really.
Yeah, and I know you sort of mentioned, you're kind of jumping back a little bit again. You mentioned your Wizards and how, you know, proud people are, and how Max was with White Peaks. We've also got Craig in, who's one of the whiskey ambassadors for Paul John, and he's saying, you know, that they have your awards hanging in their visitor centre and things like that. So, you know, it is something to be very proud of when you win these awards.
Yeah, I know it's slightly different now. That I know that there are a million awards now, and you know, I saw a comment from Edwards. What's his name? Winston Edwards at Balcona.
Paul, yeah.
And he goes, "Oh, good." He wrote a tweet saying, "Oh, good. I've just been asked to enter yet another whiskey awards. Just what I need." And I smiled at that because he's, as I say, Winston supported us for a long time. But suddenly everybody wants to do awards because they think it's a cash cow. The thing is, I've got the books and the background to put some credibility to that, and that's necessary. And it means masses to me that anybody's got any of my books, and it means masses to me that somebody thinks my award is worth putting on a wall, because that's all it is. It's a self thing. It's not a financial one.
Yeah. So with world whiskies, then we know you have a big passion for Scotch. We know you've obviously got the passion for English. What countries actually exciting you in the world whiskies, you know, category?
Well, that's
apart from them all.
Quickly as I possibly can. What I would say is, where I'm really excited is that we talk about grain, yeast, and water as the three ingredients of whiskey, but we really don't talk. We increasingly do, but we haven't spoken enough about peat or drying materials and about wood. And oak is a fascinating thing because it just does totally different things depending on where in the world it's from. Jerry Tosh did a great description about Scottish oak, because the sun hardly ever comes out. When it does, the tree has to try and reach out for it and grow, and it gnarls it. It's all gnarled like that. Whereas in America, where they have these, in the Ozarks, wherever it is, they have these very, very hot summers and very sharp cold winters. So the oak shoots up, and it makes the whole structure of the oak very, very different in terms of porous and ability to absorb things. And I went on a Swedish cruise, and I was desperate to see box. And I went down there and introduced myself. This is on a cruise. What they do is they go off Stockholm. As soon as they're a mile off land, all the taxes change. So they can have tax-free whiskey, and then they get drunk overnight, and then they get taken back into Stockholm, and then another load get on. Yeah. And all the ambassadors who drunk all night the night before on a ship realise they've got to do it all again with a whole new group of people. It's quite.
Yeah, this is the Cinderella cruise, isn't it?
Hey,
it's the Cinderella cruise.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brilliant, absolutely great. Although I did attend a Lefroy masterclass early in the morning, and when you've been up drinking nearly all night, and John, his name escapes me, the master distiller at Lefroy, he wasn't well. I mean, he genuinely wasn't well. He wasn't hungover. He wasn't hungover or sick from alcohol. He wasn't well. And there was something surreal about watching, icebergs going past the window while you're Lefroy tasting on a ship with somebody who's really not up to it. And John Campbell, of course, it is, sorry. Anyway, I went down to box, and they gave me this sample, and they said, "How old do you think this is?" And it was as dark as chestnut. It was a really heavy sherried whiskey. And I tasted it. It was lovely. It was absolutely lovely. And they said, "How old do you think it is?" And I sort of guessed around 3. I thought it'd be young, 3.5 maybe. 97 days. Yeah. It was 97 days, and it'd been matured in Hungarian oak, which is just totally different to, East European oak can really be absorbing. Australian oak, you can't mature whiskey in it because it leaks. So it's a fascinating subject, wood, and what woods can do, and whether there's some exploration to be done there. And the other thing is with drying materials, because when I did my Whiskey USA book, I hadn't really appreciated that the reason the Minnesota Vikings are called Minnesota Vikings is because they are Scandinavians who came across the top of the world and settled right at the top of America. So when you watch American football and it's snowing in December, you realize now, I do, that how far north that is. And that culture is so alien to Santa Fe, which is on the Mexican border, and it's basically, hot and almost desert-like. And they use twigs there to dry their barley. And if you think the difference between Highland peat, which is full of roots and tree roots, and it's quite savoury and sour, and Isla peat, where there are no trees, so you've got this much lighter, floral, sweet sort of peat. If that can be that much difference there, across the world, it's immense. So I think lots and lots of experimentation to be had, and America's fascinating because it has a lot of cowboys, it has a lot of rubbish, but they're Americans, so they're very entrepreneur. They all open their distilleries at weekends. They all do cocktails. They know how to make whiskey an event, and they're trying really interesting things. So America's always a fascination. Very quickly, I've mentioned Australia. I love what's happening on Tasmania, not just Tasmania, actually, Starwood on the mainland. And I haven't spoken to David Baker for a long time, Bakery Ale on the mainland, Cameron Syme at the Great Distilling Company on the mainland. You know, there's some great stuff. And I really like the fact that they're selling their whiskey into nightclubs. So I met a girl called Alex. She runs about 5 or 6 bars across Melbourne and Sydney, and we've become incredibly good friends. And she's serious, but she's in her 20s. She's very modern, but she has a whiskey bar, and she has whiskey in different environments. She has different whiskey bars, and that's not unheard of. They're really at the forefront. I'm writing for an Australian magazine, and it's hard because they've come out of lockdown. They're really open. Writing to an audience on the other side of the world who are 6 months ahead of you is kind of tough. But I love what they're doing down there, and I love their attitude. It's so kind of happening and young and exciting. Sweden, you can't go past Sweden for the complete opposite reasons. They're very serious, very thorough, but capable of producing the most amazing whiskey. And they're using juniper twigs, dry their barley, which gives a flavour that's common to the Swedish palate, because that's how they smoke their food for winter. You know, use a very salty peat because originally it's from under the Baltic Sea. So that saltiness is something that my wife's Danish, and she eats this rock hard black bread. I can't think of anything more horrific. But, you know, and she likes great big fat pork. Well, she's gone vegetarian, but when she ate meat, she'd happily have a great load of fat. It's just a totally different attitude to eating. And that's reflected in how they're making their whiskey, not the fat bit. At the end, the other place I'd mention is where I'm working most, and I'm really excited about, and that's those regions of southern Germany, Austria and Switzerland. There's some great whiskey makers coming out of that part of the world. They do, unfortunately, it's been postponed again, but they do a whiskey tasting on a boat that stays in dock on Lake Constance.
All right.
Twice, and this would have been the third time, and that's one of my favorite couple of days, because they do some judging of whiskey on the first couple of days, then they have this event on this boat, and there's such a pleasant, there's a little bit of rivalry between the Swiss and the Austrians and the Germans. It's kind of interesting to see this, but it's all very good humoured and they like a drink, so that's a treat. So they're the areas I would point to, but then I would also say you may well have yourself or other people listening may well turn around and say, well, did you know they're doing whiskey at X? I could be out of touch. I do need to do some research. I focused on what has paid the bills, and I haven't been doing much, and perhaps I should have been using my time better. But, I think there's probably whiskey just popping up all over the place that I don't even know about.
Well, this is it. I think that is the point, that there are so many new distilleries popping up. I mean, the interesting thing was there, with this group, we do have a few ambassadors working in, and Richard, I can see him, he suddenly pricked up as soon as you mentioned that Swedish company. I can't for the life of me think what it's called. I'm sure Richard will tell us if he wants to. He's reaching for a bottle now.
Oh, I've got product placement set there to do the talking for me, I think, yeah.
I made sure, Richard, that we don't see your picture at all on the recording, So as you can maybe guess, Dom, Richard works for McMyra. So he was quite interested in that one.
Yes, yeah. I joined in February, so I knew that our peat was unique. And as you say, you go from island to the Highlands, you have these huge differences. You go around the world, you're of course going to get more. I didn't know, however, that it was under the Baltic Sea, so I appreciate the lesson, Dom. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll be careful what I say. I probably made that up some time ago, but hey, fake news, I don't know. But I'll tell you what, I mean, I love Angela to death. I mean, I've had some of my funniest times. I was really keen to see the maturation caves out on the islands off Stockholm, which were the old armory places. So she said to me, to meet her down at this particular point early in the morning. I was going back that day, so we had to do it early in the morning. So I got there, I said, how are we going to get there? And she said, well, there are taxis. You can get boat taxis out to the island. I said, oh, she said, but we're not going to do that. She made a phone call, and suddenly, around this huge police boat turns up.
Wow.
So we get onto this police boat. He takes us out to the island. We get off. We go in. She's got her own. They've got funny names like the Cheeky Smoky one and things, but she's got her own casks in there. And it is the most bizarre place to mature whiskey, in an old cave that's basically part of an armory off Stockholm. And at the end, the police boat came back and picked us up, and it shot across the Stockholm. So I felt like, I was in Wallander, I felt like I was in some, and we arrived into the main city centre of Stockholm on a boat. And of course, everyone's looking because it's a police boat. And I'm kind of standing there. I've never done anything so bizarre as that. But I really, really especially love the seasonal releases. So what I love about Myra is, the core range is great, but then these seasonal, and you don't know whether you're going to get something really smoky or it's going to be very peaty or fruity. It's just, that is how to do magic, I think. I hope everything's good with Myra, and I'm glad for you. Congratulations.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. It's my first gig in the industry, and I'm very excited. I was a fan for a year and a half or so before joining as well, so it's special for me. Very happy, but yeah, nice to hear about that story. I know that we've got lots of different warehouses dotted around Sweden of all different sizes, but haven't been there yet. So it was meant to go at the end of March, but COVID got in the way.
Yeah, well, that's the unfortunate nature of it, isn't it? The other one, they're going into an underground mine, and it's something out of James Bond. The whole thing is, the whole story is loopy, and as I consider myself fairly loopy, and I kind of go with it. I get Sweden. It's great. I'll tell you the other thing. You've got to be really careful though, because nobody asks you questions more difficult than Swedish men. I don't know if it's not nastiness. They're not trying to be clever. They just like to show each other they know more than you do. Right. But they ask, like, what cleaner do you use to clean the pipes? Why would I know? The famous story about this was. Sorry, have I got time for this story?
You've got as much time as you want.
Oh, okay. So my favourite story about a Swedish taster was Dave Broom used to do a column for Whisky Magazine when I was the editor, and he wrote about he'd been to Whisky Live, he'd gone to a Richard Patterson seminar, a masterclass, and Richard Patterson said at one point, he said, and then you get a lovely long finish, and this person taps Dave Broom on the shoulder, and he said, how many seconds is a long finish? Dave Broom said, I don't know, it was just long. He said, you call yourself a whiskey writer and you don't know how long a long finish is. And he wrote a column about how over the top sometimes your enthusiasts can be about things that really aren't that important. And the following year, I went to Richard Patterson's masterclass, and at the end of it, Richard came over to talk to me. And while we were chatting away, this bloke came across, who I'd never met, and he said, Richard, I was wondering, can you tell me how many seconds is a long finish? Because Dave Broom didn't know. And Richard Patterson, without a blink, said, the common view is a short finish is anything under 4 seconds, although some people think it's 5 seconds. A medium finish is 5 to 9 seconds, and then anything over 9, although again, there's some dispute, anything over 9 or 10, depending on who you're talking to, that's a long finish. And the bloke said, thank you, I knew you'd know, Mr. Patterson, and walked off, and Richard just winked at me. But that's the sort of level of question you get from Swedes.
Yeah.
I'll be on the lookout. Thank you for the tip. Yeah.
Can I just say as well, Richard, obviously, sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, don't forget to send the check now that you've been featured on this thing for a few minutes. So, because obviously you'll be putting a check in for your wages. So,
well, I think now I'll have to, won't I? Yeah, I'll be booking.
Yeah. You've gone above you've gone above the long finish, so you've had more than 10 seconds worth of publicity. So, but no, that's an interesting point. That that you kind of have a country or how do I phrase this? A set of people that will ask different types of more intriguing questions, and for somebody to come out and ask how long is a long finish, it's a strange question for me.
Yeah, unbelievable. But Yeah, I joined the Stockholm Heavy Metal Society. They have a Stockholm Heavy Metal Society, Malt and Metal Society, Stockholm, and I joined it. It's a long story, but it was because it doesn't matter why I joined, but I joined anyway. When I was in Stockholm, I went to this event, and quite literally, they had a tray in front of everybody of 12 whiskies. Name them. No clues, no information, nothing. Just 12 brown liquid whiskies. Name them. I've never, and everyone was watching to see how I was going to do it, and I hadn't a clue. There's no way you can do stuff like that. Anyway, at the halfway point, they then put up what they were in the wrong order, so at least you work out.
Yeah.
And because it was a heavy metal society, you had to bring some music to play, and they would have to get up and put their iPod or whatever it was onto the thing and play some music. And I got the first album by Rival Sons, which came out on a Monday in the UK. And this was on the Thursday, this event. And I put it on, and they all looked at each other and just shook their heads. And I said, what? They'd all heard it. They were all in bands in Sweden. And Swedish heavy metal is quite a thing, actually. But they all involved record labels, so they'd heard all the new releases. So you can't outwit them. You don't even try.
Yeah. And I mean, an interesting one, you kind of touched on it there, was, and I know we spoke about sort of traceability and transparency earlier, and the peat situation, which always intrigues me, because obviously, like you say, Sweden is using its own peat, but then you jump across to India with Paul John, and they're importing peat from Scotland. So they're obviously bringing it from Ireland and from Aberdeenshire. And that's quite an interesting thing, because does that then take away from the fact it being an Indian malt or not?
Somebody's just said that Finnish heavy metal is better. Just thought I'd comment. I don't know. I don't know. It's like saying that, I don't know, cognac is better than whiskey. It's not a field I'm an expert in, to be honest. But I will listen out for Finnish heavy metal, that's for sure. No, I go back to my answer about transparency. The thing about Amrit and John Paul, or Paul John, is that they're perfectly open about what they're doing. I mean, Amrit's done amazing stuff. You know, some of them, and I think it's incredibly innovative. And one of the things that I'm starting a new job in August, and I can't really say too much about it because I don't think it's common knowledge, and I'll upset. But one of the things we're doing is we'll be doing blended malts, and one of the things we'll be looking at is doing things like next year the Lions Tour, I think South Africa. So we might do a Great British blended malt.
Yeah.
Or we may even do a international rugby blended malt and include South African whiskey in it. I've already spoken to South Africa about the possibility of this happening, and it's not off the table. But you know, Australia and New Zealand have done Digger and Ditch, which was an Australian and New Zealand malt mixed into. Well, somebody's now decided Norwegian's even better.
Yeah, I'm going to say I think we're kind of going off to being a heavy metal discussion soon. So,
but no. So I've got no problem with it. I think innovation, experimentation, is something you can't do with Scotch. So that gives people an advantage to do something, and you can do it around anything. You know, maybe England are playing India at cricket over a summer, 5-test summer. Maybe aim blended malt of Indian and English whiskey at the cricket clubs. Something that the English whiskey company might want to do, possibly, and on we go. And as long as it's clear what it is, and actually it's done in the spirit, i.e. the quality's there, you get somebody who knows what they're doing, making that mixture, then I'm all for it. So moving peat from country to country, or using barley of grains from different countries, that's the way it always is. I mean, you want to get close to home. I live in the east of England. Where do you think most of our barley goes?
Exactly.
Yeah. You know, you ever want to see a Scottish distiller get nervous? It's when a member of the SNP says that Scotch whisky should have only Scottish ingredients.
Yeah.
It doesn't do it.
Yeah, and I mean that's one thing I think Matt Rainier is trying to get, where, you know, the Irish are only using Irish barley. The English maybe only use English, and the Scottish only use Scottish. I don't think that'll ever come to fruition, but it would be an interesting way forward.
The thing about Mark is Mark, and I think there's a place for both. Mark basically talks about terroir, and he did it at Brookladder. You know, they still do. They will take a specific field or an Isla barley or whatever it is, and that's great. That's absolutely fine, but that doesn't exclude doing it another way. And actually, if you want to get too nitty-gritty, talk to Amherst about their molasses whiskey. And they'll tell you that they can't justify using huge amounts of what is food in a country where people starve. You know, to make single malt whiskey with Indian malt whiskey, Indian barley, is literally to take food out of the mouths of babes. You know, I know that sounds melodramatic, but I don't think, if he wants to do Irish terroir, that's fine. No problem with it. In fact, I'd love it. You know, I'd love to be able to do a tasting where we looked at whether the differences really exist. Bill Lumsden would say that he's done it all. He's done all of that. And he would say, yes, it does make a difference, but doesn't mean you can't do something. And actually, it's an advantage. You know, I always think that it's Scotch whiskey is a tanker sailing away, and it takes a long time to turn that tank around. Yeah. But what we're doing, what you're doing, and what other distillers are doing, and the whiskey clubs are doing, they're acting like speedboats. They've sped up the whole industry, and there's good and bad in that. I don't like online tastings. I think I've described them as not making love to a whiskey, but a quick bang in a back alley. You know, it's speed dating for whiskey fans. I don't think you can. Michael Jackson would turn in his grave to see whiskey treated like that. You know, he used to sit there with his glass, and you'd say, "You've got to give up, Michael, because we're now moving on to another category." And he'd say, "Somebody spent 25 years making this. I at least deserve to give it the time it deserves." And I don't think speed tasting does that. So anyway, but there are lots of good things about being able to react to taste and quit. And if it means taking people away from vodka or gin or brandy, I'm there.
Yeah. You know? Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing, like you say there, is, you know, obviously with the virtual tastings, you know, I mean, at the moment, obviously we've got to do them. And the thing, I think it's a good thing in a sense, because it kind of gives you a reach to a bigger audience, in a sense that, you know, yes, you can go and visit a club and speak to 20 people, but with a virtual tasting, you can speak to 20 people in 20 different countries. The downside to that is, as we all know, whiskey is a social drink, and doing it online, you don't get that interaction. You don't get that feeling of being in a room and talking to people. You don't really get to have that interaction with the people that you're engaging with, and that is the downside of virtual tastings, I think.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the fact is that, you know, it's sorry, I've got a fly.
All right.
Yeah, I think the point is that there's no choice at the moment, as you were saying. There's no choice, and I'm really impressed at how quickly the world of whiskey has found ways to keep going. But, you know, I was thinking about it the other day, well, yesterday. I haven't actually sat and spoke to a live human being since lockdown, not one. Everyone in my family has, because they've got friends locally, or my wife goes off and sees a friend, but I haven't, and it's massively missed. And when my son had the friends over for a barbecue last week, and they were chatting away, and they hadn't seen each other for ages, and there was a buzz, and they were social distancing, and I was so proud of them. He's 22 and living here, but his friends are all in the garden. They had a barbecue, and it was just so. We had an impromptu whiskey tasting. And it was just so great just to have interaction with human beings. Ed, his friend Ed's a big Tottenham fan, so we have a bit of banter over that. Oh, good, you know. Is that your team?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we had an interaction, I think, was it 3 years ago when you won the league? We had a little interaction between us back then, so... Because I think at one point I'd said something, I think it actually upset you, and... I can't remember what it was now. It was somewhat silly, and yeah, it was one of those. I think I'd said something like, "Yeah, you're lucky to have won it."
You see, if I was offensive, I apologise.
No. There was no offense. No, I don't mean it like that. It was a lot of banter between us at the time because we were obviously chasing you. But anyway, we digress. So we'll talk about that after the recording.
So to go back to what were we talking about?
So obviously social distancing and things like that.
Conversation about the need to meet around whiskey and the social thing. Yeah, and also you things happen. A lot of the interactions. You know, you won't drop a little piece of information necessarily in this format. But if we were sitting in a pub and you say, yeah, it was like such and, I say, what's such and such? And you might tell me something I didn't know. And it's those sidebars that get lost. The direct interaction is fine, but without meeting together and sharing, and you know, and did you know X? And yeah, I think whiskey. I'd also, you know, I'm starting to sense that you know, whiskey could be quite seriously hit if things don't, you know, if things carry on, and if we do start getting second lockdowns and stuff, you know, I think there could be a hard wave of redundancies, and it's just very, very sad.
Yeah. No, I mean, you know, I know we talk to Dave a lot on this channel and, you know, on social media, and like the same as you've said, some people are just people, and they need that interaction. I mean, I've been quite lucky because I'm still at work during the day, so, you know, I'm out every day, but I know Dave's itching to get back out on the road, and obviously, like yourself, you know, you're saying you're missing that interaction as well, and that's the downside to all this.
Yeah, without a doubt. And you know, for me, because I became fairly reclusive. I don't go on a lot of communal press trips, hardly any, and I'm not on social media in the way I used to be at all. Little bit, but not much. But I go to the whiskey show in London, and on the media day, and I'd stand, and I probably wouldn't move for 7 hours, and I'd meet everybody I wanted to speak to in the industry, and it was the best social, you know, it's the best use of my time because everybody's there, and you suddenly look up and it's 5 o'clock, and it's drawing to a close, and you think, I haven't done anything yet. You know, and I think a lot of people are like that. They maybe only catch up with people, you know, there are people I don't see, and you always say it, oh yeah, we must go for a beer, but it never quite happens like that. Yeah. You have an event that focuses it, and whatever your hobby, I'm very much into the whole concept of Maori. They talk about iwi, and the iwi is tribe. So your whanau is your family, and that's the people, you know, your family. But the iwi is your tribe. And I found that I was watching a lot of Iron Maiden concerts. I'm putting an Iron Maiden shirt on to watch an Iron Maiden concert on video, on DVD, or whatever, because everybody at an Iron Maiden show wears an Iron Maiden shirt. And that's part of my iwi, you know, it's my tribe. Leicester City is part of my iwi. And that's why I put on a tribe shirt to watch a football match on telly. What's that about? But it's about belonging to something. And going to a whiskey event is just that. I always shows that we're actually a little bit full of ourselves because we're part of a huge club, but it's still a tiny fraction of the population. And the ones who get it really got something special, and everyone else is missing out. That's how I feel. I just look around and I think, you know, we've got all, this is our world. These are our friends and our iwi. And I feel sorry for people who don't get it. I really do.
Yeah.
You need to share that.
Yeah. So going back to whiskey, because we have digressed a little bit. I know you've mentioned, you know, I'm pretty sure you've got a big passion for Australian whiskey, Starward, things like that. And like you say, they are putting their whiskies into bars and pubs and things like that. I absolutely love Starward. I think what they're doing is superb. I think their whiskies are very, very interesting. And I know a lot of people try to compare them. And again, going back to the age statements, to the no age statements, this is where it kind of becomes a little bit unfair for places like Australia, places like India, places like America, because their whiskey is matured a hell of a lot quicker than other countries. So they feel the need then to put it out as a no-age statement. And this is where you sort of think to yourself that that no-age statement works, because if you put that 3 or 6 year old on a bottle, people overlook it.
Yeah, this is a fascinating area because I actually, what I'd say is that if we were having this conversation 15 years ago, it would have been on another level, because most people really wouldn't have had the ammunition or the material to make value judgments that they do now. And I think people now do accept or do understand that whiskey does mature at different temperatures, different rates in different countries, and they've tasted products to prove that's the case. So I think we've probably moved on from initial argument. And you know, it's funny. We'll go back to Sweden. The guy Henrik Mullen up at Spirit of Heaven. He what came up as a whiskey. Actually, well, I was talking to him at a whiskey live event, and he was talking about having a sort of symbolism on the bottle to show scientifically the level of maturity in it. And I thought only a Swede could come up with it. I know these are terribly racist generalizations. I'm aware of that. But we're talking shorthand. But the idea of having a scientific guide to something being mature to drink is, I think, it is the way that a Swedish whiskey maker might think. And I don't think it would work. And the way I say is, I think at the end of the day, it just comes down to personal taste. You know, what I say is, I've used this any number of times, but it's a good descriptor, and that is that you might like roast chicken, I might like fried chicken, but what we both hate is raw chicken, because raw chicken is bad for us and it's undercooked, and we both know it's not how it should be. And that's how I feel about whiskey that's sold immature. It's a personal taste. If I like an Amaret at 4 years old, 5 years old, and you happen to like Scotch at 18, a Macallan 18-year-old, there's no right or wrong in that, but they're both good whiskies for whatever they are. You give me a Scottish whiskey that's 6 years old, it really shouldn't have been out the cask until 10 or 12 perhaps. And it's going to taste reedy and sappy, and I just hate that taste. I hate it. So that to me is undercooked chicken. So I think we're past the age of it. We're back to the transparency argument.
Yeah.
And you know, people like you, all of us are talking to distillers all the time, and the Australians are not shy of giving an opinion. You know, they'll tell you as they see it, which is great. And it's exactly the same argument with English whiskey. When English whiskey came out at 3 years old, I personally didn't like the unpeated version. I thought it was too young.
Yeah.
Jim Murray scored English whiskey very, very highly, very highly. In fact, he had nowhere else to go. And it took me probably a few more years to get to the point where I was scoring English whiskey at that sort of level. And there's some of the English whiskey bottles have been just fabulous. But the thing is that if you sell a bottle of whiskey, you can only do it once.
Yeah.
Before the person tastes it and makes their decision. So English whiskey was always going to sell well in Norfolk. Everybody wanted that first bottle. Because it was good enough, it continued and grew, and as it got better and better, it's grown and grown, and that's great. But if you tell a story that this is a great whiskey, the Americans do it quite a lot, I have to say. I get whiskey, they enter stuff into awards, and you taste it, and you say, you can't possibly think this is a balanced, mature, rounded, drinkable whiskey. This is not. I tell you, used to do it a lot. The Alpine regions, before they learnt how to distill, there's only one distillery that whenever I got a bottle of it, I poured it straight down the sink. It smelt as sick. It smelled, because the way they were maturing, everything that they were doing was based on making fruit liqueurs and Genevers. It smelled like sick, and I couldn't do anything with it. I couldn't drink it, and I couldn't give it to you because you think, what the hell's he doing giving me this shit?
Yeah.
So I couldn't take it to tastings. Now, that doesn't happen very often, and to be fair, standards are better than that, and the knowledge of making whiskey has got a lot better. But you can't there's lots of people out there blogging and tweeting who are not idiots.
Yeah.
And even if they're sent free sample, this is the other reason I don't particularly like online tastings. I mean, organised by a distillery as an event that you tune into. A lot of people want to get the samples for free, so they'll say whatever they have to say to continue to get whiskey. And I am cynical enough to think there are people who do that. And I did the last online tasting I ever did was Glenrothes, and the first whiskey up was their non-age statement Glenrothes, which I found quite sulphury. I'd written the notes in the afternoon so I could type them in to keep up with all these people online because it was so fast. I couldn't even nose the whiskey in the time they were putting up their notes. But anyway, I said, it's sulphury. Somebody said, I don't get any sulphur. Somebody else said, neither do I. And somebody else said, who do you think you are, Jim Murray? Then somebody said, I'm getting a sort of rubbery note. So I put in capitals, sulphur. Somebody else said, it's a bit metally, sulphur. And then the third note was, it's a bit like burnt matches. And I put effing sulphur. And finally, I just finished my sample and I'm getting sulphur. And I said, I rest my case, I'm finished. And I went, I had a paddy fit.
Yeah.
And I've never done one since.
Yeah.
But if you taste it and you like it, and people do like sulphury whiskey, I'd have no real issue with it if it's deliberate. And Jim hates it. If you like something, you like it. If you don't, you don't. You won't buy it or get it again if you don't like it. So I think we're past the age statement thing. I think it's just you need guidance because there's so much choice. And who's going to spend 35 or 40 pounds on a bottle of spirit from some country that, you know, that's not known for making whiskey when they could get a really decent Scotch for that money? So,
yeah.
You know, it's a case of, I think people like yourselves and all the whiskey clubs around the country and all the shows have done masses to actually let people decide, you know.
Yeah, I think you raised two very good points in that. One is the honesty of people that are blogging or writing about whiskey. And I know as somebody, my philosophy behind that is I don't think there are necessarily bad whiskies. You'll know better because you'll have tasted a lot more than me that haven't maybe made it to market. But I don't necessarily think there are bad whiskies. I think there are whiskies that don't suit our individual palates. That's not to say there aren't bad whiskies, because we could all name one or two definitely that have come onto the market and you think, how the hell have they managed to get onto the market? But I also agree with you though, where you see some people that are doing tastings and things like this and you just think, you know, you're not being as honest as you could be. And, you know, I think that is an issue, especially when free samples are there, because I think people think when as soon as you get into blogging that everybody wants to send you free samples, and it just doesn't work like that. So, you know, that you then go down the line of saying, this is fantastic whiskey just for the sake of it, when you don't really like it and what you're doing.
Yeah, it's an incredibly complex area because, you know, I mean, it's a fine line. I mean, I once got told that I particularly didn't like a particular non-age statement, and the company said, well, the thing is, it's not aimed at you. It's aimed at people at entry level who are stepping up from another category and discovering a whiskey. So it's an entry level. I said, so you're telling me actually it's whiskey for people who don't know what good whiskey is? It's a fine line. You're telling me you're passing off something that I don't think is good enough, but it's okay for somebody who doesn't know any better. That's not wrong. But having said that, I'll tell you a quick story which affects, unfortunately, you again. I'm not being paid, by the way, by an English whiskey company. That's an absolute fact. But I did, at the time of the referendum on Scotland going to independent, I did a tour of England, and I called it, if they don't want us, we don't need them. The whiskies, Scotland versus England whiskey tasting. And I took 3 English whiskey company whiskies and 3 Scotch whiskies of 12 years old. And what I do is I talk about them over 2 hours. but I would taste them in the wrong order. So nobody knew actually which one they were tasting at any time. And they had to vote. And then I compiled the votes up and announced the result at the end. And in every single place, English whiskey won over Scotch. Every single one. Except for in Birmingham, there was one bloke sat right at the front. And he was staring at me. And I thought, oh, God, he's not happy. What have I said to offend him? So it got to the interval. I went to the bar. He came up to me and he said in a Scottish accent, "This is fantastic tasting. I really enjoyed this." He said, you know, he made a few points. Anyway, at the end of the tasting, England won again. And I was feeling a little bit embarrassed because there's Scots guys there. Anyway, he puts his hand up and he asked the question. What he said was, he said, "Is it possible that in a room like this, of people who have not tasted this whiskey before, on the very first tasting, English whiskey is less complex and maybe slightly sweeter and easier to like initially than some 12-year-old Scotch, which is obviously more complex and is more of an acquired taste?" And I think that's an absolute brilliant answer, because there's no doubt about it. You know, they do it in Ireland. Jameson used to do it, but now, well, Tullamore was doing it, where they give you a Jack Daniels and a Johnny Walker and a Jameson, and you taste all three, and you have to vote for the one you like best, and guess which wins every time? Jameson, because it's easy drinking, sweet, triple distilled, so smoother. It's not got peat and rougher notes. So for an audience that doesn't know any better, James is going to win every time, and it does. But that doesn't mean that Johnny Walker Red Label or Jack Daniels aren't great drinks. They clearly are, because they sell en masse. So it's an interesting subject, this, and we are getting into that area of you're getting into that thing about, and I really don't like going here, because I honestly, I say it not because I'm a humble person, but it's true. The only reason I got where I got is because I've more practice, you know. My example, I've used it a million times. You put me in a shed with a guitar, I will never come out Jimi Hendrix. Jim might, but I might become a very good guitarist. And that's the difference. I don't think I've got a natural palate. I don't think I've got anything that everybody else that goes online talking about whiskey couldn't do. I just have been spoiled in that I spent 17 years doing nothing else but drinking it.
Yeah.
And I get to know more. That's it.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
interesting area.
Yeah, I kind of think that's a very good point. The fact of some, you know, obviously some people comment they're not picking up these notes, they're not picking up that, they're not doing this, they're not doing that. And I kind of think that comes down to two things. One is how much you are drinking and practicing that technique, but it also comes down to your reference point, because the amount of people that will say it tastes like this type of vanilla or that, well, if you haven't had that, you cannot find that. So to me, whiskey and nosing and tasting is all about memories and reference points in the past. So therefore, if you haven't had them memories and reference points, you're not going to find that.
Totally right. I remember a few years ago saying to my wife, "What's star anise?" And she said, "If you don't know what star anise is, why are you even thinking about using it as a description?"
Yeah.
I said, "Because I think I know what it is."
Yeah, but I mean, I saw a comment, and I can't remember whether it was in the in our online chats and things like that, or where it was, but somebody kind of said, well, if you go around your house smelling things, then you get them memories. And to me, sometimes that doesn't really work, because you buy these tasting kits and you go down trying these, and the amount of times you don't get anywhere near what it's supposed to smell like, because that's not the memory you've been given.
Yeah, without a doubt. You know, and that's another thing that I learned very early on from either Michael or Dave, was actually there's too many people who try to show off with the tasting. It's not about anybody being impressed. It's about you being able to reference yourself, so that when you come across another whiskey and it's described in the ways that you described the one you liked before, then you might like this one. And that's really that's all it's for. And when you look at Michael Jackson's writing, if you go back to his whiskey, the hardest thing I've ever had to do, I honestly felt the first time I updated Michael Jackson's whiskey, but you know, his book, The Companion, the first time I did it, I used to stand, I still do, I stand in a particular place to do my tastings. Yeah. Which is a neutral zone. I always do them at the same time. I always do them in the same place. And And it's not necessarily when my palate's probably its best, but I don't tend to taste in the morning, probably when I should taste, but that being my day written off, because I tend to absorb a lot of alcohol, and that's just the way it is. Anyway, I honestly felt that I had the ghost of Michael on my shoulder when I updated his book. Because if you read what he writes, there was a court case over that first book, and the family took action against the book being republished. And they took issue with a descriptor I used of Michael Jackson, that he was frugal in his writing. But if anybody knows anything about journalism, journalism is all about spoken speech rather than written literature, and using as few words as possible to describe something in the simplistic terms. You look at Michael's, he's a former journalist like me, from the north of England like me. And if you read those books, he uses one word where some writers use 10. And if a tasting note, an intro for a newspaper article, especially a tabloid, shouldn't be more than 20, 25 words, tops. The same with descriptors. I don't care if it's citrusy, it can be lemon. I don't want to hear that it's Sicilian lemon at dawn on a bank holiday, because that's crap.
Yeah.
You've
been reading my blog, haven't you?
I'm not above doing it. We used to have a magazine in New Zealand, and they had a back page called Sood's Corner, and I was regular in there. Yeah. I was a much writer, and I would use a description of a band that played in Auckland, and they just run it. When you read it at breakfast time, on a cold winter's day, and you read it, and you think, oh God, did I say that? Oh my God. So I'm not knocking it per se, but frugal is good, and the use of language it doesn't need to be all floral and all over the place.
Yeah. No, I know, as you say that, the reason I say that is because in my younger days I used to do a lot of fishing, and one of the places we used to go, you used to walk across barley fields and through rape fields and through an apple orchard and things like that. And certain whiskies, every now and again, just take me back to that. So, that's kind of, instead of picking a particular scent out, I'll say, it's like walking through a meadow on an early morning with the dew on the grass and things, because that's where it takes me back to. And it's
that's
not,
fine. I'm not knocking that at all. I once described a whiskey in one of my books. I said, this is the Wheating Steam Fair, a mixture of candy floss and oil grease or something. Yeah. And anybody being to one of those places where they have the old tractors and the old engines pumping, and the smell of the smoke and the oil, and then they've got a fair with candy floss and sweets, and they know exactly what that description thing is. A tiny little place up in Norfolk, nobody's been. So you can do it, and I 100% think, in fact, it's another really good reason for why this lockdown's so sad. It's because I never do tasting notes at a distillery, because it's like getting a bottle of ouzo in Greece and bringing it home, and it sits in the cupboard forever, because it tasted great in sunset Greece, but it doesn't in downtown Leicester, and it's the same thing. And if we can't get out, we can't expand our experiences. But that to me that's the essence of it all. When I taste I don't know, a nice peated Lefroy or Ardbeg, I'm back on the island. But Bowmore, as soon as I taste a cask strength Bowmore particularly, I'm sat on a wall because you go in the warehouse there. He's gone now. Percy used to pour you about this much in the glass, and it'd be 8 o'clock in the morning, and your flight was that morning, and you sip it and say, that's very nice. He goes, I can't believe you're in a Bowmore distillery and you're not going to finish your whiskey. So you'd knock this cask strength whiskey back, and you do 3 of them, and you didn't need a plane to get home. You'd fly home. He'll be tasting it 24 hours later. But he'd let me sit on the wall at Bowmore and looking across to Brookladdy with the sun skitting off the Lochindale. That is my favourite view in the whole world. And every time I have a cask strength Bowmore, that's where I am. Yeah. And if you've done it, then it makes immediate sense. But if you haven't, sitting on a wall at Overstrand in Norfolk, looking at the sea and the sun flicking on, today would be great. Sunny and windy. So the Seoff Overstrand would be just absolute a treat. And that's exactly that. So yeah, I totally get that. Totally get it.
No, I mean, you know, that's one thing I do agree where you say, you know, I do all my tasting notes exactly where I'm sat now. I will not do a review unless I'm sat here, because if you do a review in the distillery, you're already in a different place. You've already got different smells. So it's kind of, and every whiskey always tastes better at a distillery. We all know that, you know, it's as simple as that. The amount of times that I've bought a whiskey from a distillery and you get it home, you think, this isn't like what I tasted before. And that's why, you know, I insist that all my reviews are done here. And I think that's kind of the way you should do things, that you've got to be in a mindset and a familiar place. So when you're smelling things, you're not picking up things that aren't in the whiskey. Because one good representation of that was, we was at a festival in Birmingham 2 years ago, and I was tasting the Paul John Canya, and we were sat there, and I think there was 3 of us stood around, and it was like, do you know, all I can get out of this is coffee. It's such a strong sense of coffee. And the other 2 people were like, yeah, we're getting that coffee, we're getting that coffee. And we drank it, and it was like, there's no taste of coffee, it's just on the nose. And we just turned round, and right behind us was the coffee station. And if I'd have been doing a review there and then, that would have been coffee, and it wasn't even in the whiskey.
I'll tell you what, I did it once myself. I was tasting for the Independent Bottlers Challenge in Whiskey Magazine some years ago. And I tasted 3 whiskies in a row, and every one of them had this really lovely floral rose, lovely note coming off it. But it was the same in each of the 3.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, what's that going on? And I realised I got aftershave on, and I got fingers, and all I was smelling was my aftershave.
Yeah.
And I know people laugh at Jim Murray about his rules about not coming anywhere with makeup or aftershave or perfume, but it makes a lot of sense, really.
Yeah.
But I totally get that. It's just, yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Sweat it.
But what I'll do now, Dominic, I'll just open it quickly up to the group, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording in a minute, and we'll just have a general chat off recording. But does anybody have any questions for Dominic before we stop the recording? Go on, Richard. I can only see you, so if anybody else is putting their hand up, don't just unmute yourself and ask, please, because I can't see you all.
I think Paul Whitson might have put his hand up as well, so I'll cede the floor to him. If that was the case, yeah. There's only something, Dom, you said earlier about virtual tastings compared to in real life tastings. I think there will be some people out there that are very grateful for virtual tastings to come around, because you know that's what they might prefer. But I would expect the majority of us are really looking forward to getting back out into the real world, whether or not we're presenting or we're just sitting down and tasting something. But something that Soren said when you spoke about that was that where you are can have a great deal of impact on your enjoyment and how much you might appreciate the whiskey, or the opposite, for example. But in a virtual tasting world, where someone's sitting at home and they're just in their normal environment, there's nothing particularly special around them, perhaps, depending on where they're doing it, of course. But the social aspect's also missing. Would that not make it perhaps more of an accurate way of assessing a whiskey for somebody that was sitting in their living room, as opposed to being at a tasting, buying a bottle, getting home, opening it, and then thinking, this isn't quite as good as I thought? What do you think about this?
That's a good question, because it's difficult to know, you know. It's difficult to... In a strict form, you're absolutely right, that would be the case. But I also think the fact that it tastes good when it's shared, and you know, the warmth and happy memories are also, you know, I've just recently tasted 25 cask samples, all from 25 different casks, all from the same distillery. And I've got to basically rule out which ones aren't good enough to be bottled as a single cask and the ones that are. And they're all from the same distillery. So the only way to do it is in isolation, because the differences between them, I mean, some are just not good, and you think, no, it's too sharp, too much wood, that's not working. But most, it's nuanced. And I've said before, I haven't got the most advanced palate in the world. So I need to think very, very carefully about what I'm tasting. And in that environment, I have to be in isolation, without doubt. But then there are fun whiskies. There are whiskies that, Dave Broom used to talk about Old Pulteney as a sort of the old 12-year-old. Not that I've tasted more recently and it's not the same. But the old 12-year-old, he used to describe it as a pull out the cork and throw it away type of whiskey, because it's 4 friends, you will drink the bottle. Now, I think there's different grades. There's some people who collect whiskey, there's people who taste it, but on very, very, very scientific and things level. I'm not one of those people. I have virtually, I don't keep whiskey. I just don't. I drink it and I share it. And if I have it, I'll get a group together and we'll drink it. And some of those whiskies, they're just for fun. And the experience is, they're just, it's like, I suppose, having a nice, competent, perfectly good car, but it isn't a Rolls Royce or an Aston Martin, but it does. So I think there's horses for courses. I'm using a lot of cliches, I know I am. But I do think that we could have too much science. Sometimes it's just, in my most facetious moments, people say, what's the best whiskey you ever had? And I said, well, it was at 6 o'clock in the morning and I was sat on a grass bank outside Norwich Hospital and I had a little plastic bottle of Bell's and a little plastic cup. And I put the plastic Bell's into the plastic cup and drank it while I phoned people to say my first son had been born. And that was the best whiskey I've ever had. Mm. And I tell that story purely because I think sometimes we can get too hung up and too into, what's good, what isn't good, etc. Sometimes it's just about the moment. Like I don't like planned nights out. I don't like being told I've got to go to a nightclub. But if I'm in a pub and we end up going somewhere and it's spontaneous, they're often the best night. I hate New Year's Eve because it's all prescribed. Yeah. But if you sometimes fall into something, then that's the pleasure. And it might be you bump into people you didn't know, or you make new friends and you bond over a whiskey. And in that sense, it's all about being out in social. So it's not an easy answer.
No, I think it feeds in a bit to what the discussion you guys were just having a moment ago as well, about where you make your notes when you're doing it in a more scientific setting, perhaps, so things are consistent. So I guess, horses for courses. If someone asked me what I prefer to do, it would be go and sit in a room full of people, like-minded whiskey folk, and enjoy the company and the drams. But if I wanted to read something from someone like, from yourself or any of the other guys actually in the group here today, I'd be happier knowing that somebody was doing it the same way every time, so it's a bit more accurate, perhaps.
And you're in a really good position for this, because you're going to take a product to people who might not know what Mackmyra is all about and why, and you'll be able to tell them. And I think one of the greatest things in our business is watching the lights go on in people's eyes when they suddenly get it. Oh, that's the reason, that's that. I remember the first time it happened to me, I was in a room of all the best whiskey writers in London at the time. Charlie and Michael, everybody was there. And they'd got, we'd had a concert by a very talented singer from Islay who sang Gaelic songs. And they had 3 casks of Bowmore from the 60s. I mean, serious stuff. And they were full of spirit that had either been distilled. 2 were distilled on the same day and the other was distilled a week apart. But one had been kept in Oloroso, one had been kept in Pedro Jimenez, and another had been in Bourbon. So 3 different casks, all through the same life, same age, same experience, but different sorts of wood. And they were all, as you'd imagine, 30-year-old, whatever it was. A bit less than that. But anyway, I was terrified. I was well out of my depth. I just started the job and I knew nothing about this sort of thing, and etc. But I remember tasting a pineapple-y taste in the bourbon one, and Michael Jackson said, I'm getting that distinctive Bowmore pineapple note. And it was like, bling! It's like the first time I saw a floodlit football pitch. Bright, all the lights came on. I still remember the first time I went into Leicester City and the floodlights were on at night, and 7 years on or whatever it was. you don't forget those memories, and that's what whiskey can bring. And you have the power to bring that to people, and that is the greatest part of this job.
No pressure.
Totally agree. So Paul,
Dave Worthington would agree with every word of that.
yeah. Paul, did you have a question?
Yeah. So obviously you mentioned a bit earlier on that one of the things that you were sort of fascinated about was different sort of peat styles being used around the world. But what about any other sort of things that the non-Scottish people can do, like non-oak casks and things like that? Do you have any sort of views on the different woods being used?
Hi. There are Scottish distilleries that have casks that they shouldn't have, and they are used. They tend to be used for. They're not meant to be there. They tend to be used very secretly for blending, and they're a result of days when money was tight in the industry and oak wasn't necessarily affordable. But the truth be told, you'd go a long way to find another wood that could do anything like oak does. Oak is just such a remarkable wood in every way. It's flexible, it's strong, it's porous in that it lets air in and out, but it doesn't leak from the liquid. You know, it interacts with the spirit. It can absorb other drinks into its interior so that they can come out in the whiskey. So there are people trying all sorts of different woods. Woodford Reserve are probably the biggest company that did it. They do a kind of an experimental whiskey every year, and they've done things like sweet mash rather than sour mash, and they've done 4 grain instead of 3, and they've done whiskey in maple wood and cherry wood. The truth is, it just doesn't make whiskey on the way that, I mean, Scots pay a lot of. I joke a little bit about it. It's probably a terrible thing to do, but basically what I say is, if there was a cheaper way to make Scotch whiskey, the Scots would have found it, and there isn't. And so this is where I don't think Scotland needs to be too worried, because it does what it does so brilliantly, and there's not going to be a whiskey lake anytime soon. You know, demand for whiskey is where it is. So I don't think Scotland needs to be too worried or too bothered. I don't think it would find anything as good.
Thanks, Tom.
I've got a quick question, sort of your views on whiskey festivals, I suppose. How do you, or what do you think about people judging whiskies at a whiskey festival, in particular aged whiskies, given that they're obviously drinking a lot, they will have a palate overload, and they won't give an old whiskey enough time in the glass that you would if you were at home, I suppose?
Yeah, it's always been a slight problem for the whiskey industry, this, because for the reasons you say. Firstly, you know, if you're under time pressure and you've got so many whiskies you're going to drink, then as you say, you're going to rush through them, etc. There is also a problem that's built in. If you talk to some of the distillers, I don't know how true it is now because I haven't been to whiskey shows for a while, but Whiskey Live used to, every year, the same people would come back and want something better than they had the time before. Mm-hmm. So they basically upped the stakes each time. And distillers just didn't see the point. They were giving away, you know, rare and old whiskey. You know, I know that Whiskey Exchange now has a separate event where it does just much more expensive whiskies, and that's one way around it. I know that there are plenty of distillers who have special bottles for special people, and they keep them under wraps, and when the moment comes, and they can sense from the conversation that they're having whether the person, you know, is obviously a fan but hasn't had something nice, it might be worth doing. But it is a problem, and the other thing is the nuance of aged whiskies. A lot of people, you know, it's that thing about being 25 years old Scotch. Some 25-year-old Scotches are beyond the pale, and some are not, could last another 3 or 4 years in a cask, and some are just perfect at that age. But what happens is that the amount of judging becomes narrower. So as the wood and the oaky tannins take control, the actual quality of the whiskey becomes harder to find. And it's not an environment to find it. You're quite right. You sat with a glass and nosing it and taking your time with it and treating it with the respect it deserves, like Michael Jackson used to do. That I'm not sure they have a place in a standard show. But I have to say, to be totally honest with you, I'm not the best person to ask because I don't have to face that problem.
Yeah, and the reason Chris asked you that is because he runs one of the good little whiskey shows at Stoke-on-Trent. So, you know, obviously, yeah.
Can you put it back on again? Can I ask him a question?
Yeah.
Sorry?
How have you found it then? How successful have you been? And do you get a real mix of people, different experiences and ages, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, we've done 5 years of it. It's supposed to be the 6th this year, but we've obviously had to cancel it, unfortunately. But yeah, I mean, the range of people that we get as sort of year on year has been getting, I think, to start with, there weren't many people that knew much about whiskey. There was a few, but they come every year, so we're getting the same people come every year, or at least enough of them, and they're bringing their friends to educate them as well. So the range is quite good. Also, the mix of male female as well is better than we were expecting. We get a lot more women there than we were initially expecting from it, and that seems to be growing as well. So yeah, we always get good feedback from it as an event, because it opens people's eyes to sort of distillers that they've never heard of, because that's one thing we'll always try and do. So people enjoy it. I just question how effective it is to judge a distiller at a festival necessarily. I mean, I obviously love them. I'll go to as many as I can, but I don't. Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily write a distillery off if I didn't enjoy it at a festival. It might just have been my palate was ruined at the time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Do you have separate masterclasses?
Yeah, we have two masterclasses for it. We tend to go for about 30 to 45 minutes for them. Gives people a bit of a break within the festival. And we think that's sort of long enough for people. We try to get one relatively early on whilst people are still sober. That tends to go down a bit better.
Okay, great. Brilliant. I think Stoke-on-Trent's looking a lot more exotic than I remember it.
Right, just to sort of jump in now, what I'm going to do is stop the recording. So thank you very much, Dominic, for coming on and talking to us, getting quite in depth with some things, and obviously chucking in the heavy metal as well. What we'll do now is I'll stop the recording, and please everyone just unmute yourselves and we'll go from there. But thank you, Dominic, and brilliant talk. Yeah.
And I told you I wouldn't bore you with Leicester City.
Who?